Life is about connection, but it's also about discernment. Every relationship in our lives either feeds our growth or slowly chips away at it. A wise woman understands this. She doesn't make grand declarations or dramatic exits. Instead, she quietly chooses to protect her peace. By gracefully cutting ties with those who hinder her journey, she creates room for love, courage, and authentic connections to flourish. The chronic taker is someone we all encounter at some point in our lives, often without realizing their true nature until we've already given too much. These individuals have a way of embedding themselves into our routines, our relationships, and even our sense of responsibility. They don't take with malicious intent, at least not always, but their actions slowly create an imbalance that can leave us feeling drained, used, and undervalued. What makes the chronic taker so challenging to recognize is their ability to blend their needs with a semblance of gratitude, often masking their taking as a natural part of the relationship. A chronic taker doesn't always start as someone who asks too much. In many cases, their behavior develops over time as the boundaries within the relationship begin to shift. They might begin with small requests, things that seem harmless, even thoughtful at times. They rely on our generosity, our empathy, and our natural inclination to help those we care about. It's not always a conscious manipulation, but it becomes a pattern that serves their needs while neglecting ours. They often appeal to our sense of duty or compassion, weaving narratives that make their taking feel justified. What makes the chronic taker's presence so insidious is how they often operate under the guise of friendship or love. They use charm, vulnerability, or even humor to maintain the relationship, making it harder for us to identify the imbalance. Their requests can seem reasonable in isolation, but accumulate over time, leaving us wondering how we've ended up shouldering so much responsibility for someone else's happiness, well-being, or success. This slow erosion of boundaries can be exhausting, leaving little room for self-care or reciprocity in the relationship. One of the most difficult aspects of dealing with a chronic taker is the emotional toll it takes on us. We might begin to question our own worth, wondering if our inability to meet their endless demands reflects a flaw in ourselves. Their consistent need for more time, more attention, more resources can create a dynamic where we feel perpetually inadequate, as though no matter how much we give, it will never be enough. This cycle of giving and feeling unappreciated can lead to resentment, but the chronic taker often has a way of deflecting accountability, turning the focus back on us as the source of the problem. Recognizing a chronic taker requires us to look closely at the patterns in our relationships. Are we always the one making sacrifices, bending schedules, or compromising our needs to accommodate theirs? Do they express gratitude in a way that feels genuine, or is their appreciation fleeting, quickly replaced by another request? When we try to set boundaries, do they respect them, or do they find ways to guilt us into compliance? These questions are uncomfortable but necessary if we want to understand the dynamics at play. It's important to remember that not every taker is malicious. Many chronic takers are simply unaware of the impact their behavior has on others. They've become accustomed to a dynamic that works for them, often without considering how it might be affecting us. This lack of awareness doesn't excuse their actions, but it does provide an opportunity for us to address the issue with compassion. We can choose to have honest conversations about how we feel, expressing our needs and boundaries in a way that invites understanding rather than conflict. At the same time, it's crucial to acknowledge that some chronic takers will resist change. They may see our attempts to set boundaries as a threat to their comfort or security, reacting with defensiveness or manipulation. In these cases, we have to decide what's more important, maintaining the relationship at the expense of our well-being, or stepping back to protect our peace. This decision is never easy, especially when the chronic taker is someone we care deeply about, but it's a necessary step toward reclaiming balance in our lives. The chronic taker often thrives on our reluctance to say no. They rely on our desire to avoid conflict, our fear of being perceived as selfish, or our unwillingness to disrupt the status quo. But saying no is not an act of cruelty, it's an act of self-respect. It's a way of acknowledging that our time, energy, and resources are valuable, and that we have the right to decide how they are used. By setting boundaries and enforcing them consistently, we can create space for healthier, more reciprocal relationships. In some cases, the chronic taker might genuinely want to change. They might not have realized the extent of their behavior until we pointed it out. And they may be willing to work toward a more balanced dynamic. This requires patience and a willingness to hold them accountable, but it can lead to a deeper, more authentic connection. However, change is only possible if both parties are committed to it. If the chronic taker continues to resist accountability or make excuses for their behavior, it may be time to reassess the relationship. Letting go of a chronic taker is not an act of selfishness, it's an act of self-preservation. It's a way of honoring our own needs and creating space for relationships that nourish us rather than deplete us. It's a reminder that we are not responsible for fixing or saving others, and that we have the right to prioritize our own well-being. By releasing the chronic taker, we free ourselves to focus on the relationships that bring joy, support, and mutual respect into our lives. The constant critic is a person who, at first glance, might seem like they're helping. Their words might masquerade as advice or constructive feedback, but they carry a weight that feels different, heavier, sharper, and more pointed than guidance should. They're the ones who always have something to say about how you could have done better, tried harder, or thought smarter. Their remarks often land not as encouragement, but as judgment, leaving you questioning your worth or your abilities. It's subtle, almost imperceptible at times, but over days, weeks, or even years, the erosion of your confidence is undeniable. What's challenging about this dynamic is that it's often cloaked in the guise of care or concern. They may say things like, "I'm just trying to help," or "you know I want the best for you," which makes it even harder to call out or identify their impact on your self-esteem. When the constant critic operates in your life, it's not just about the words they use, but the underlying energy they bring. Their tone, their timing, and their body language can all contribute to the subtle message that you're not enough. Imagine sharing an idea you're excited about, only to have them point out every possible flaw before you even finish explaining. It's deflating, and over time, it trains you to second-guess yourself before you even speak. You might find yourself walking on eggshells around them, rehearsing conversations in your head, trying to anticipate their critiques and brace yourself against their inevitable judgment. The emotional toll is insidious, creeping into parts of your life that have nothing to do with them. In many ways, their criticism reflects more about them than it does about you. Often, constant critics carry their own insecurities and unresolved fears. They project their doubts onto others because it gives them a fleeting sense of superiority or control. It's their way of shielding themselves from their vulnerabilities. However, understanding this doesn't necessarily make it easier to endure their behavior. It's one thing to have compassion for someone's struggles, but it's another to let their issues dictate how you feel about yourself. One of the most dangerous aspects of a constant critic is how their words can become the voice in your own head. You start internalizing their negativity, questioning your choices, and doubting your instincts. You might begin to edit yourself, holding back on opportunities or relationships because their criticism has planted seeds of fear or hesitation. Over time, their influence can limit your growth, keeping you from stepping into the fullness of who you are. What's worse, their critiques can become so normalized that you don't even recognize how much they've affected you until you step away. It's important to remember that constructive feedback is fundamentally different from constant criticism. Feedback is rooted in care and support. It's specific, actionable, and delivered with the intent to help you grow. It feels empowering, even when it points out areas for improvement. In contrast, criticism often feels draining, diminishing, and demoralizing. It focuses on flaws without offering solutions, and is frequently delivered in a way that feels more punitive than helpful. The difference is in how it leaves you feeling about yourself and your abilities. Navigating relationships with constant critics can be particularly challenging when they're people you care about deeply. They might be friends, family members, or colleagues whose opinions you value or whose presence in your life feels necessary. The tension between wanting to maintain the relationship and needing to protect your peace can feel overwhelming. You might find yourself justifying their behavior, thinking, "That's just how they are," or "They don't mean to hurt me." While those statements may be true, they don't negate the impact their words have on your well-being. Establishing boundaries is a vital step in dealing with constant critics. Boundaries aren't about punishing someone or cutting them out of your life entirely. They're about creating a framework that allows you to thrive. They might look like redirecting conversations when they become critical, limiting the amount of time you spend with them, or clearly communicating the kinds of interactions you're willing to have. It's not always easy to enforce boundaries, especially with people who are used to having free reign in your life, but it's a necessary step toward reclaiming your sense of self-worth. Another powerful tool is reframing how you receive their words. Recognize that their criticism is a reflection of their perspective, not an absolute truth. You have the power to filter their input, taking what is useful and discarding what is not. This requires a level of self-awareness and confidence that can take time to build, but it's a skill that becomes invaluable in all areas of life. When you stop internalizing their negativity, you reclaim your narrative and remind yourself that their opinion is just one perspective among many. It's also essential to cultivate relationships with people who uplift and encourage you. Surrounding yourself with individuals who see your strengths and celebrate your victories can counterbalance the impact of the constant critic. These people remind you of your worth and help you build resilience against negativity. They offer support that feels genuine and empowering, creating a space where you can grow without fear of judgment. In some cases, the best choice may be to distance yourself from the constant critic altogether. This doesn't have to be a dramatic or confrontational decision. It can be a quiet shift in how much access they have to your thoughts, emotions, and energy. Choosing to step back is not an act of rejection, but an act of self-preservation. It's about prioritizing your mental and emotional health, even if it means letting go of someone who has been a significant part of your life. Ultimately, dealing with a constant critic is about recognizing your own worth and refusing to let someone else's negativity define you. It's about standing firm in your truth, even when their words try to shake your confidence. It's a process that requires strength, self-compassion, and the courage to choose what's best for you. While their voice may be loud, your inner voice, the one that believes in your potential and honors your journey, is infinitely more powerful. Protecting that voice is an act of self-love, and it's a gift you deserve to give yourself. Gossip is often perceived as harmless, just idle chatter or a way to pass the time, but it carries a weight that many underestimate. At its core, gossip is an insidious force that chips away at trust, tarnishes reputations, and spreads negativity. For someone who values authentic and meaningful connections, being surrounded by gossip mongers can be deeply unsettling. They thrive on dissecting the lives of others, turning private moments into public fodder, and creating narratives that often stray far from the truth. It's not just about what is said, it's about the energy and intention behind it. Gossip mongers operate from a place of insecurity and dissatisfaction, projecting their own unhappiness onto others. They wield words as weapons, often cloaked in humor or false concern, but the damage they cause is real. It erodes the fabric of trust, leaving behind a trail of fractured relationships and hurt feelings. A wise woman recognizes this destructive pattern and understands the need to step away. She knows that indulging in gossip, even passively, can make her complicit in the harm it causes. Listening to it can feel like endorsing it, and while it may be tempting to participate for the sake of belonging, she understands the cost. The cost isn't just to others, it's also to herself. Engaging with gossip creates a misalignment with her values, and that dissonance can breed feelings of guilt and discomfort. She values honesty, kindness, and integrity, and gossip is the antithesis of those principles. Choosing to remain silent or redirect conversations can feel isolating in a culture that often normalizes gossip, but she knows the importance of staying true to herself. Gossip mongers thrive on the unspoken agreement of their audience. The nods, the laughs, the subtle encouragement, these are what fuel their narratives. Without an audience, gossip loses its power. A wise woman silently withdraws from these dynamics, removing herself from conversations that compromise her values. She doesn't confront or criticize, she simply chooses not to participate. Her silence is not an act of approval, but a boundary she sets for herself. It's a refusal to be drawn into the negativity and toxicity that gossip breeds. This decision is not always easy, especially when the gossip involves people she cares about. There's a fine line between wanting to defend someone and recognizing that engaging in gossip about gossip only perpetuates the cycle. By stepping away, she protects not only her integrity, but also her peace of mind. Gossip creates a noisy, cluttered mental space filled with judgments and assumptions about others. It shifts the focus outward, diverting attention from her own growth and goals. A wise woman understands that her energy is better spent elsewhere. She chooses to focus on building others up rather than tearing them down, seeking conversations that inspire, uplift, and connect. This isn't about pretending that flaws or mistakes don't exist. It's about addressing them with compassion and respect, directly with the person involved if necessary, rather than through whispers behind their back. The challenge of dealing with gossip mongers lies in their persistence. They often test boundaries, seeking validation or camaraderie through their stories. A wise woman sets clear, consistent boundaries without anger or judgment. She redirects conversations or changes the subject, signaling her disinterest in gossip. Over time, this creates a shift in dynamics. Gossip mongers may begin to avoid bringing their stories to her, recognizing that they won't find the reaction they're looking for. This doesn't always mean they'll change their behavior entirely, but it limits the impact they can have on her life. She cannot control their actions, but she can control her response. There's also a deeper layer to why gossip is so corrosive. It fosters a culture of mistrust and fear. When people know someone is prone to gossip, they become guarded, hesitant to share their thoughts or feelings. Relationships lose their authenticity, replaced by a performative version of connection. A wise woman values genuine relationships too much to allow this dynamic to take hold in her life. By cutting ties with gossip mongers, she creates space for relationships rooted in trust and respect. She attracts people who value her for her authenticity and integrity, not for her willingness to indulge in drama. Gossip also has a ripple effect, impacting not just the immediate subjects, but also the broader community. It creates division, pitting people against one another and breeding resentment. A wise woman is keenly aware of this and chooses to be a force for unity rather than division. She doesn't pass judgment on those who gossip, understanding that it often stems from their own pain or insecurities, but she also doesn't excuse it. Her decision to distance herself is an act of self-preservation and a commitment to fostering a more positive environment for herself and those around her. In choosing to step away from gossip mongers, a wise woman also demonstrates the power of quiet strength. She doesn't need to call them out or make a public display of her values. Her actions speak for themselves. Over time, this consistency becomes a beacon for others who share her values. She inspires change not by demanding it, but by embodying it. Her refusal to engage with gossip sets a standard for how she expects to be treated and how she treats others. It's a subtle yet profound way of leading by example. This choice, while empowering, can also be lonely. Stepping away from gossip often means stepping away from certain social circles or dynamics. It requires a willingness to prioritize quality over quantity in relationships. A wise woman understands that not everyone will understand or support her decision. But she remains steadfast. Her peace, integrity, and authenticity are worth far more than the fleeting sense of belonging that comes from participating in gossip. In the long run, the relationships she cultivates will be stronger and more fulfilling because they are built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. The perpetual victim is someone who lives in a constant state of blaming others for their challenges, hardships, and lack of progress. They create an endless narrative of external blame, pointing fingers at the world while refusing to take accountability for their actions or choices. This mindset creates a pattern that traps them in a cycle of negativity, with little room for growth or self-reflection. Interacting with someone who always sees themselves as a victim can feel like trying to fill a bottomless well. No matter how much empathy, understanding, or support you provide, it's never enough to change their outlook because the core issue lies in their unwillingness to take responsibility for their role in their experiences. Engaging with a perpetual victim can be emotionally draining, especially for those who genuinely care about their well-being. These individuals often present themselves as helpless, which can evoke a natural desire to step in and offer assistance. Over time, however, the constant narratives of how the world has wronged them become a weight, pulling down the emotional energy of those around them. The pattern is predictable. A new issue arises, the focus remains on external blame, and when a solution is offered, it's often dismissed or ignored. This dismissal is not necessarily because the solution isn't viable, but because it doesn't fit their ingrained story of powerlessness. Their identity becomes intertwined with being the wronged party, making it challenging to break free from this self-imposed cycle. It's important to recognize that the perpetual victim's mindset isn't born out of malice or intent to harm others. Often it stems from unresolved pain, trauma, or feelings of inadequacy that have never been properly addressed. These experiences can create a lens through which they interpret the world, one that magnifies perceived slights and minimizes their own agency. While their struggles may be valid, the refusal to acknowledge their role in navigating those struggles can lead to stagnation, both for themselves and for those who attempt to support them. For those who value growth, being in a relationship with a perpetual victim can present a unique challenge. Growth requires accountability, the willingness to reflect on one's actions, and the courage to make changes. The perpetual victim, however, often resists these steps. This resistance can create tension, as one person seeks solutions and forward movement, while the other clings to their narrative of external blame. Over time, this imbalance can erode the relationship, creating frustration and resentment. It becomes evident that no amount of external effort can shift an internal mindset that is not ready to change. In recognizing the impact of a perpetual victim, it's essential to approach the situation with compassion while also setting firm boundaries. Compassion allows us to see the pain and insecurity that often drive this mindset, reminding us that their behavior isn't necessarily a reflection of who they are at their core. Boundaries, however, are what protect our own well-being and energy, ensuring that we don't become enmeshed in their cycle of negativity. Without boundaries, it's easy to become overly invested in trying to fix or rescue someone who is not ready to take ownership of their own journey. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with a perpetual victim is the guilt that can arise when stepping back. Society often teaches us that helping others is a virtue, and walking away can feel like a betrayal of that value. However, there's a critical distinction between supporting someone who is actively working to improve their situation and enabling someone who is not. True support empowers others to recognize their own strength and agency, while enabling perpetuates their reliance on external sources for validation and solutions. It's not an act of abandonment to prioritize your own well-being, rather, it's an acknowledgement that you cannot do the work for someone else. The relationship dynamic with a perpetual victim can also reveal deeper truths about ourselves. It can highlight our own patterns, such as the need to be a fixer, the tendency to avoid confrontation, or the fear of being perceived as uncaring. In this way, the challenges they present can become an opportunity for growth, encouraging us to examine our own boundaries, motivations, and capacity for self-care. By navigating these dynamics thoughtfully, we not only protect our energy, but also model the kind of accountability and self-awareness that the perpetual victim struggles to embrace. Ultimately, the choice to distance oneself from a perpetual victim is not about rejecting them as a person, but about creating space for growth, both theirs and our own. It's a recognition that relationships should be mutually enriching, fostering a sense of connection and progress rather than draining our emotional reserves. While it's natural to want to help those we care about, it's equally important to recognize when our efforts are not making a difference, and when the best course of action is to step back and let them take responsibility for their own journey. The boundary breaker is someone who consistently oversteps the emotional, physical, or mental lines you've drawn for yourself. These individuals often dismiss or disregard the clear signals you've set about what you're comfortable with, making their own needs or desires the priority over yours. They can be subtle, acting as though your boundaries are negotiable or unimportant, or overt, bulldozing through them in a way that leaves you feeling disrespected and unseen. This dynamic is particularly draining because it forces you to constantly reaffirm your limits, as if your well-being is up for debate. These interactions with a boundary breaker can feel like a constant tug of war. You may find yourself explaining and re-explaining why a particular action or behavior is unacceptable to you. And yet, instead of acknowledgement or effort to respect your needs, they often respond with defensiveness, excuses, or attempts to guilt you into compliance. This cycle creates an emotional toll, leaving you questioning your own worth and whether your boundaries were valid in the first place. Over time, this erodes self-trust and undermines your ability to advocate for yourself in other areas of life. There's an unspoken disrespect inherent in the behavior of a boundary breaker. They may frame their overstepping as care, insisting they just want to help, or dismiss your concerns with phrases like "you're overreacting" or "that's just how I am." While these comments may seem minor, they reflect a deeper issue, a disregard for your autonomy. These individuals often center themselves in the narrative, focusing on their intent rather than the impact of their actions. This tendency makes it difficult to establish a meaningful dialogue where your needs are heard and respected. A boundary breaker's refusal to respect your limits often reflects their own insecurities or unmet needs. They may struggle with feelings of rejection or fear of abandonment, prompting them to push against the lines you've drawn in an effort to maintain closeness or control. However, this doesn't excuse their behavior. Everyone carries their own emotional wounds, but it's not your responsibility to sacrifice your peace for someone else's healing. Recognizing this dynamic is a crucial step toward reclaiming your space and prioritizing your well-being. You might notice subtle ways a boundary breaker tests your limits. It could be a friend who constantly asks for favors without regard for your time, a family member who insists on discussing sensitive topics you've asked them to avoid, or a colleague who delegates tasks to you without permission. In each of these scenarios, the underlying message is the same: your comfort and boundaries are secondary to their agenda. This pattern can manifest in any relationship, and identifying it early can prevent further emotional strain. Engaging with a boundary breaker often requires significant emotional labor. Setting boundaries is an act of self-respect, but when those boundaries are continuously challenged, it forces you into a position of constant defense. You may find yourself justifying decisions that shouldn't require explanation or minimizing your own needs to avoid conflict. This dynamic can be particularly harmful if you're naturally empathetic or prone to prioritizing others' feelings over your own. Over time, it becomes clear that maintaining these relationships comes at the expense of your emotional well-being. Walking away from a boundary breaker doesn't mean you lack compassion or understanding. It means you've recognized that a healthy relationship requires mutual respect and consideration. It's about honoring your limits and trusting that the right people will value them without question. It's also about giving yourself permission to prioritize your peace, knowing that true connection doesn't require constant justification or negotiation. Boundary breakers often rely on emotional tactics to maintain their position in your life. They may use guilt, framing your boundaries as selfish or unnecessary, or employ charm and flattery to downplay their behavior. This emotional manipulation creates confusion, making it harder to trust your instincts. You might second guess whether your boundaries were too rigid or if you're overreacting. However, your feelings are valid. Boundaries exist to protect your well-being, not to accommodate others' preferences or comfort. Establishing and maintaining boundaries is an ongoing process. It requires clarity, consistency, and the courage to face pushback from those who refuse to honor them. With a boundary breaker, this process can feel like an uphill battle. They often interpret boundaries as a form of rejection, rather than an expression of self-care. But it's not your responsibility to manage their feelings or to make them comfortable with your choices. Your only obligation is to yourself and your growth. Stepping away from a boundary breaker can be a difficult decision, especially if the relationship has deep emotional ties. However, it's an act of self-preservation. By removing yourself from the dynamic, you create space for healthier relationships, ones built on mutual respect and understanding. It also sends a powerful message to yourself and others: your boundaries matter, and your peace is non-negotiable. Reclaiming that space is not just an act of courage, it's an act of courage. It's an act of love for yourself.